Faces that, at least for me, are unfamiliar. And moreover, since we're webcasting, and so presumably those not sitting here in this auditorium are also listening, let me say just a word or two about the Woodrow Wilson Center. We were established by the U.S. Congress 40 years ago as the nation's official memorial to President Woodrow Wilson. Unlike the other memorials in this city, we're a living, breathing institution. We seek to promote Woodrow Wilson's twin passions of scholarship and public service. As some of you may know, before entering the political arena, Woodrow Wilson was a distinguished scholar. Indeed, he's the only American president to have earned a Ph.D. He was also president of Princeton University, and then took what some would say was a step down to become president of the United States. The Wilson Center is a nonpartisan institute for advanced research and study. We seek to provide a neutral forum for serious, informed, open discussion. We promote cutting-edge scholarship by bringing to Washington preeminent thinkers around the world, sticking them in an office, giving them a computer and a research assistant and access to the Library of Congress, and simply the luxury of getting away from their day-to-day lives so that they can do some sustained reflection and writing. We also sponsor meetings such as the one we are having right now. Our event this afternoon, as of course you know, looks at U.S. engagement in and with Southeast Asia. Surrounded as it is by large and powerful countries, many of whom have, or at least some of whom have nuclear weapons. The countries of Southeast Asia are often, frequently something of an afterthought for many Americans as they do think about Asia. So it's a special pleasure for us to be hosting this meeting today. It's a special pleasure to welcome to the Wilson Center the U.S. government's point man on Southeast Asia, Scott Marcial. Scott, as you know, I'm going to turn things over to my Wilson Center colleague, Michael Kugelman, who will introduce you. But I also want to extend my own welcome to you. Look forward to your comments. And I hope, and I have no doubt, but that your comments today will encourage all of us in this city to think more seriously and to think more often about Southeast Asia. So welcome. Michael, it's yours.
Thanks, Bob. I appreciate it. Again, I'm Michael Kugelman, Program Associate with the Wilson Center's Asia Program. Thanks to everyone for coming today. Recently, I came across a book published by my Wilson Center Asia Program colleagues in early 2005. And the book is an assessment of President Bush's first-term policies on Asia, and it contains a good amount of material on Southeast Asia and on some of the issues and challenges that affect U.S. engagement in this region. And what I found striking is that every one of the issues mentioned in the book is still salient today, and some of them even more so than before. I'm referring here to counterterrorism, democratization, what to do about Burma, improving the U.S. image in Southeast Asia, increasing influence of China in the region, and of course transnational challenges like human trafficking, infectious disease, environmental degradation, and the like. So there are many potential things to talk about, and of course what I've just mentioned represents a very small sample of themes informing U.S. relations with ASEAN countries, but I'm not the one to do the talking this afternoon. That will be the job of Ambassador Marcial, to whom we're grateful for briefing us today on U.S. engagement in Southeast Asia. And just before we start, just an administrative matter, please turn off any cell phones, pagers, Blackberries, walkie-talkies, the like. They interact very poorly with our microphones here and cause loud noises. So thank you for your cooperation in that regard. So let's begin. Ambassador Marcial currently serves as Deputy Assistant Secretary, East Asia and Pacific Bureau, responsible for relations with Southeast Asia, and as Ambassador for ASEAN Affairs. Ambassador Marcial is a career member of the Senior Foreign Service, and he joined the State Department in 1985. His most recent assignments were as Director of the Office of Maritime Southeast Asia, Director of the Office of Mainland Southeast Asia, and Director of the Office of Southeastern Europe. He's also held positions in Vietnam, the Philippines, Hong Kong, Brazil, and Turkey, as well as in the Economic Bureau's Office of Monetary Affairs. So he will give his presentation, and then he's kindly agreed to respond to your questions after he speaks.
Good afternoon. I want to thank you very much to Bob Hathaway and to Michael Kugelman for inviting me here to speak today on U.S. engagement in Southeast Asia. It's actually a great time to talk about the U.S. and Southeast Asia. It's 2 weeks after the visit of Philippine President Arroyo and Vietnamese Prime Minister Zoom to Washington, where they met with President Bush. It's a few weeks before the annual ASEAN Post-Ministerial and ARF meetings, where we'll be represented at a high level. And it's about a month before President Bush travels to Thailand, as the White House announced last week. It also comes at a time when we're continuing our extensive efforts to promote progress in Burma. The Burma question, as you know, has dominated Southeast Asia, the Southeast Asia agenda, for significant periods over the last year, kind of starting with the government's crackdown against peaceful protesters last September, and then again highlighted recently with the tragic cyclone that hit Burma and the response to that cyclone. The work on Burma has occupied certainly a lot of my time. I would say the preponderant amount of my time in the year I've been in this position. In fact, I've visited Burma twice in the last 2 months. First, going in on the initial C-130 relief flight with Admiral Keating, our Pacific commander, and USAID Administrator 4, and then going back a few weeks later to attend the pledging conference. So I've actually been very focused on Burma, and I look forward to talking about Burma in my remarks today. But this isn't a speech about Burma. This is a speech about all of Southeast Asia and our engagement there. And so what I'd like to do is begin by talking very simplistically in some ways, what are our interests in Southeast Asia? Why do we care? And let me throw a few numbers at you. Maybe you know them, but they're worth highlighting, I think. The ASEAN 10 countries have more than 550 million people, include 2 treaty allies, include the world's 3rd largest democracy, which also happens to be what some people are now calling an environmental superpower. The countries enjoy, for the most part, rapidly growing economies, make them very dynamic. Collectively, ASEAN is our 5th largest export market. It's home to a lot of friends. It's home to the Malacca Straits, one of the most strategically important shipping routes in the entire world. So Southeast Asia for us is very important politically, strategically, economically, and diplomatically. We tend to look at Southeast Asia and think about Southeast Asia issues only. But in fact, what we're seeing and welcoming is Southeast Asian nations taking a bigger role in the world. For example, right now you have 2 ASEAN nations, Vietnam and Indonesia, serving on the UN Security Council, where they play hugely important roles. Our fundamental interest in Southeast Asia is clear. We want the countries of Southeast Asia to remain strong and independent. We want them to enjoy peace, stability, growing prosperity, and increased freedom. And we hope that they will work increasingly with each other and with us to tackle regional and global problems. If the countries of Southeast Asia are doing well, moving along these lines, then we're in great shape in our policy in Southeast Asia. So much of our work and almost all of our assistance in the region is focused on helping these countries achieve success, broadly defined. Now, I wasn't sure how to tackle the China piece of this. China always comes up. So let me just make a couple of quick comments. We're often asked, what about the role in China? What about China's rising influence in the region? Well, it's a fact that China is growing economically and playing a more active role in much of the world, certainly including in Southeast Asia. We don't see this as a zero-sum game. This is not a U.S. versus China situation. We engage in Southeast Asia on the merits of Southeast Asia. We understand and we expect that the countries of Southeast Asia will want to have good relations with China as well as with us. That's fine. That is not a problem. We talk with the Chinese about Southeast Asia. We want to work with them where we can, and we encourage them to play a positive role. The other question is, what do the nations of Southeast Asia want from us? And obviously, I can't speak for Southeast Asian countries, but I travel a lot there. I've been to Southeast Asia, I think, 4 times in the last 5 months. I've hit, I think, 9 of the 10 ASEAN countries. My strong sense is they want more of us. They want more of the United States. And it's kind of funny because sometimes you'll see in the opinion polls in the region that people's views of the United States are not as high as we would like them to be. Or you hear criticism of various U.S. policies. That's true. But nonetheless, what I hear when I travel from officials and from others is we want the U.S. more engaged. There is a desire for constant reassurance almost that the U.S. will stay engaged, is committed to the region. There is a desire for more trade, more investment, more education exchanges, more technology, and the list goes on. So overall, they want more of the United States. They want more engagement. They want us to engage as a partner who can help them solve their problems. And we are engaged. We are doing more. We're heavily engaged on many levels, bilaterally and increasingly regionally. One pillar of our engagement remains our treaty alliances, our 2 treaty alliances in Southeast Asia with the Philippines and Thailand. Frankly, these countries and these alliances sometimes are underappreciated. I appreciate them. We get a lot out of them. The Philippines has done a lot of good work to improve its economy in recent years. It's done a great job combating terrorists who have threatened mostly Filipinos in Mindanao. President Arroyo was just here 2 weeks ago to see President Bush had a very good visit. Thailand, another great ally. We welcomed its return to democracy at the end of last year, and we are working with the Thai in many areas. Most recently, we worked very closely with the Thai on getting relief supplies into Burma, and the Thai, I have to say, were very helpful. As I mentioned earlier, the White House has announced that President Bush will be visiting Thailand in about a month. We also are continuing long and good relations with other key partners in the region, countries like Brunei, Singapore, and Malaysia. And it's true that Malaysian politics has gotten somewhat, shall we say, dynamic in recent months. We're following it with interest. We're studiously neutral, but we do follow with interest, and we're confident that however the politics plays out in Malaysia, the overall relationship that the United States enjoys with Malaysia will remain strong. We're building stronger ties with Indonesia, by far the largest country in Southeast Asia. It's a hugely important nation that, in my view, has undergone one of the most dramatic, positive transformations in the world over the last decade. And we should all admire Indonesia for what it's achieved. We're moving ahead smartly in our relations with Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. When I started in the East Asia region back at the State Department in 1990, we had diplomatic relations with Laos, but it was pretty limited and pretty cool. We had no diplomatic relations with Cambodia or Vietnam at all. Now we have good and improving relations with all 3 countries. Prime Minister Zoum from Vietnam was just here a few weeks ago, as I mentioned. It's the 4th high-level, meaning head of state or head of government, visit between our 2 countries in the last 4 years. I think it's remarkable. Now, much of our work in all of these relations that I've described is what, for lack of a better term, I might call traditional. I mean traditional diplomacy, dialogues to talk about bilateral and regional issues, talking about how we can build cooperation between our militaries and our law enforcement agencies, how we can strengthen cultural ties, reduce barriers to trade, tackle other economic issues, and battle threats to security. State Department plays a big role in all of these areas, but we also count on our sister agencies to do the same. For example, Pacific Command is exceptionally active in the region, building ties and doing tremendous humanitarian work, as we've seen recently in both Burma and the Philippines. Just a few examples of what we've achieved in the mill-to-mill side recently. We've resumed military-to-military relations with Indonesia, hugely important, and we're building those steadily. We're beginning to develop those same kind of ties with Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. We're starting off small, but we're doing some training, some exchanges, which I think is very useful. And by the end of this year, we and the Lao government will open defense attachés offices in each other's capitals, which is a big step and an important step. The U.S. military is working in support of the armed forces of the Philippines, which, as I mentioned earlier, has been exceptionally successful in combating Jemaah Islamiyah and Abu Sayyaf terrorists in Mindanao. On the civilian side, we've been training and supporting Indonesian police who've achieved superb results in their own battle against Indonesian terrorists, particularly Jemaah Islamiyah. But it's not all security. We've been very active on the economic side. The U.S. Trade Representative is continuing to pursue free trade agreement talks with Malaysia. In fact, I think the Malaysians have a delegation coming next week. We have trade and investment framework arrangements with most ASEAN nations, under which we're pursuing economic agendas tailored to each relationship. We agreed during Prime Minister Zoom's recent visit to launch negotiations that we hope will result in a bilateral investment treaty with Vietnam. Also, recently, we joined negotiations on investment and financial services with the so-called P4, Chile, New Zealand, Brunei, and Singapore. These are countries that already had negotiated a free trade agreement among themselves, but had not included chapters on investment and financial services. They're now negotiating those chapters, and we're joining in those negotiations. And USTR is doing an exploratory study on possibly joining the whole agreement. So all of these, what I would call traditional or basic pillars of engagement, we're very active on throughout the region. But what strikes me is that we're increasingly active on other newer issues that I think are critical to the countries in the region and to us. Let me give a couple examples. Health. This year, the United States government as a whole will spend over $200 million on health-related assistance in Southeast Asia. We're in Vietnam, we're spending $86 million this year to help the Vietnamese combat HIV/AIDS. We have a major effort in Indonesia, where more than 100,000 Indonesians have benefited already from clean water and sanitation projects. We're spending $25 million a year in Cambodia, helping Cambodians deal with a range of health issues. We've assigned, I should say, the Health and Human Services Department has assigned Center for Disease Control officials in many of our embassies, and they're developing very close and productive relationships with their counterparts throughout the region. So even in Burma, a country with which we don't enjoy good relations, we're providing assistance on HIV/AIDS and have twice provided emergency relief in response to outbreaks of avian influenza. Education is another important area. It's the biggest element in our assistance program to Indonesia. And President Bush has announced a few years ago a 6-year, $146 million education initiative with Indonesia. It's a program designed to improve Indonesia's secondary level education. We just signed an agreement, the State Department, with the Vietnamese Ministry of Education to initiate a high-level education dialogue with Vietnam as Vietnam strives to create a world-class university and otherwise improve its college-level, university-level education system. A rapidly growing area for engagement is the environment. There's huge interest in Southeast Asia now, certainly driven by climate change, but also environmental issues, other environmental issues. We're doing a lot bilaterally, but doing even more regionally. A couple examples. The U.S. is helping to fund the ASEAN Wildlife Enforcement Network, which is designed to combat illegal trafficking in illegal trade in wildlife. We are contributing about $4 million this year in seed money for the Coral Triangle Initiative, which is designed to preserve the Coral Triangle areas from Indonesia, Malaysia, and Timor through Papua, Philippines. It's a huge area. Some conservation organizations have called it the biggest conservation program in the world, and we're looking at trying to get more funding for that. We're providing funding for tropical forest preservation and the Heart of Borneo project. The list goes on. We're doing a lot in engagement in an area that we wish we didn't have to do, which is disaster relief. I already mentioned the amount of work we've done in response to the Burma cyclone. Our Pacific Command flew in almost 200 flights, C-130 flights with supplies early on. This was at a time when there was no UN air bridge in place. It was one of the very few ways we could get relief supplies into Burma. Admiral Keating, the head of Pacific Command, went in, talked with the Burmese officials, and they agreed to let us bring in these flights. So we had almost 200 flights like that, plus our USAID people contributed enormous amounts. So altogether, I think we've spent over $40 million on disaster relief just for this Burma exercise. And just recently, Pacific Command, USAID worked with Embassy Manila to help the Filipinos respond to the typhoon that hit the Philippines and the ferry sinking there. Again, the list goes on. We're also very much stepping up our engagement at the regional level with ASEAN. ASEAN has taken important steps in recent years, most notably signing a charter that gives it legal status. And it sets some ambitious goals for itself, such as economic integration by 2015, and a commitment to set up a human rights body. We support these goals. A strong ASEAN that's moving aggressively to tackle the problems of Southeast Asia is very much in our interest, so we want to support ASEAN. We established the U.S.-ASEAN Enhanced Partnership in 2005 and an action plan for that partnership in 2006. What it does is it's set out 8 areas of where we would focus on cooperation. It's very practical stuff, working with them on helping to remove trade barriers, promote economic integration, doing educational exchanges, a wide range of cooperation. We also recently, in a step that's near and dear to my heart, decided to appoint an ambassador for ASEAN affairs, which would be me. And the most important thing for me apart was I get the fancy ambassadorial title. But what it really means is we're saying to ASEAN, we take you seriously. We think it's worth having someone who's devoted full time to working with you on all the issues that you're working on, economic, political, environment, disaster relief, you name it. So it's a big step by us. Others may follow. I'm glad that the United States was the first, and I'm glad that the ASEAN nations have welcomed that. We're working increasingly with ASEAN diplomatically, which is not something we've done really before, working with ASEAN as a diplomatic entity. And it helps you have a ASEAN Secretary General, Surin Pitsuwan, who's very active, former Thai foreign minister, and he's been very active on the Burma disaster relief effort, helping to go in and open the door or convince the Burmese to open the door to international relief. And I think he and his ASEAN colleagues deserve a lot of credit for that. Now, one constant in our engagement with Southeast Asia, whether we're talking bilateral or multilateral or traditional or not so traditional types of issues, has been our work to support freedom and human rights. Issues of liberty and democracy have long been part of our agenda in Southeast Asia. Sometimes countries in the region aren't wildly enthusiastic about our comments on this, but I think for the most part they understand it's part of who we are. This is not the United States government imposing its values. I've lived in Southeast Asia, I've spent years there, and I've traveled there extensively as well. And people there, like people everywhere, they want their freedom, and they want a voice in how they're governed. This is not a U.S. value, it's a world value. And I've seen it firsthand. I saw it in 1985 when I was an election observer in the Philippines, and President Marcos said he'd just buy the votes of everybody. But guess what? He didn't, because people cared about their votes and about their rights. I saw it recently in Burma, where a lot of Burmese, showing tremendous courage, have protested and called for change in their country despite facing severe threats to their health and to their lives. So I think this is something we're going to continue to work on. We will continue to do so in a way that we want to be effective. This isn't just about us standing up and saying the right things. We want to be helpful. And so we try to understand the sensitivities in the region and respect those sensitivities and work in a positive way to support reform efforts that are already underway. That is certainly a challenge for us. And what I'd like to do is close with just a few comments about how I see our other challenges in the region. First and foremost, I think we're doing pretty well. Now, it's easy for me and kind of almost predictable for a government official to come out and say we're doing a great job. I think our relations in Southeast Asia are strong. I think we're doing good work. But we can't be satisfied with that. We can't rest on our laurels. We should and can, and should do more, and I see that as my job. Find areas where we can do more to build these relations and build partnerships that are in the interest of the United States. Let me just highlight a couple of areas that I think are important. One, pretty obvious, economics. People in Southeast Asia, like people everywhere in the world, are worried about the economy, not just right now, but long term. They want development, they want reduction in poverty. We're very active, have been for a long time, but we need to keep looking at what else can we do to be helpful, both on the macroeconomic side, on trade and commercial side. Food and energy security has certainly emerged over the last year as a major issue in the region. We're tackling these issues globally and through APEC in the region, but we'll work with Southeast Asian neighbors too, see what else we can do directly with them. A fundamental challenge that I alluded to earlier when I talked on human rights is promoting reform, economic reform, improved governance, building democracy, all of these things. Now, these have been on our agenda for a long time. They will be on our agenda for a long time. Again, we're trying to support people in the region who are trying to implement reforms. It has to come first and foremost from people in the region. It can't come from us. What we can do is try to be supportive, and that's a continuing challenge for us to find ways to be supportive. Last but not least challenge, Burma. I did say I would get to Burma, and here I am. It's a huge challenge for U.S. foreign policy. It's a huge challenge for ASEAN and for the region. You have in Burma a government that has suppressed democracy, a government that is systematically, although I don't think intentionally, but systematically driving down the economy, ruining the public health system, ruining the education system, creating problems, many of which spill across the border in the form of illegal narcotics, refugees, and dangerous diseases. It's become a pariah, and it refuses even to engage reasonably with ASEAN, of which it is a member. It's very much in our interest for Burma to turn around, both because we care about human rights and democracy, but also because Burma is an important country, 55 million people, strategically located, and if it continues to go downhill, we can expect to see much greater risks of instability and even violence. The regime's response to the cyclone showed both its callousness and its ineffectiveness. Some hope that the limited opening that we've seen over the last month or so will continue and perhaps could lead to something positive. And we will certainly do all we can to encourage the continuation of that opening. However, in my view, it's hard to see Burma turning around without some basic political change. I'm not talking about overnight change necessarily, but this government has shown that it cannot effectively govern Burma. There's an opposition, there's ethnic groups, there's a lot of people in Burma, just average people who have ideas and could contribute. Somehow, the world needs to work with the Burmese authorities to convince them to reach out to their own people, begin a dialogue with their own people, including with the opposition, and chart a new course. It's not up to us to prescribe all the details, exactly what that course should be, but there clearly needs to be a significant broadening of the political and opening of the political process, and certainly a release of political prisoners, including Aung San Suu Kyi, Min Ko Naing, and many others. We'll continue to work with countries in the region. We'll continue to work through the United Nations, with the United Nations, and we'll continue to work with Burma directly to try to achieve progress there. It's very important for us, and as I said, for the region. I'll make one more point. The last challenge, but one that I think a lot about for us, is getting the word out in the region about what we're doing. As I mentioned, I hope I've been clear, we're doing a lot. We have a good story to tell in the region. We're not doing as well as we should be doing in getting that word out to the people. Government officials understand, I think the elite understand to a certain extent, but a lot of people don't understand all the things that we're doing, despite tremendous work by our ambassadors and our public diplomacy people in the region. So a big challenge, and one that I consider central to my job, is how to get the word out. And so I very much appreciate you giving me the opportunity to get the word out here today. Thank you. Happy to take questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Marcel. I really appreciate that very good presentation. We will take some questions now. Since we started a bit late, we can go a bit into the 3 o'clock hour if need be, say 3:15 or so, so just keep that in mind. So before we start, please just keep in mind we have microphones on both sides of the auditorium. Just wait until it reaches you, and then when you're recognized, please give your name and affiliation. So, show of hands. Okay, we'll start down here in the front.
Thank you. I'm Priscilla Clapp. I have no affiliation right now, but I did live in Rangoon for a while. Since you ended with Burma, it makes it easy for me because that's the thrust of my question. But I'd also like to put it in the ASEAN context. The generals are determined, as ever, to move forward with their plan for political transition, or transition perhaps, into some form of parliamentary government that is far from democratic, free and fair, and all of the things that we stand for. What do you think the chances are, after the experience with Cyclone Nargis, for ASEAN and perhaps in turn China, India, and others to take a stronger stand as they see this process unfolding in Burma? They've been very elusive, or not elusive, but passive, I'd say, in sort of letting it move forward. But surely they can see how detrimental it will be. It just will enshrine all of the ineffectiveness and callousness and that the military is known for. And I would like to see ASEAN's success in opening the door in the post-Nargis period move now into a stronger stand on the political side. Do you think there are chances of that?
It's a hugely important question. I'm not sure I know the answer to. I know that many of the ASEANs, and as you know, ASEAN, although it's an organization, doesn't always speak with one voice. There are different views within ASEAN about this. I think there's generally a pretty high level of frustration, no question about it, in ASEAN with Burma. You'll notice that nobody welcomed the regime's sort of sham referendum as a positive step, which you might have expected. My sense right now is that the focus, ASEAN focus for the moment, is on trying to encourage the generals to allow a continuation of this opening and to see if that over time can lead to further progress. I don't detect a great interest in pursuing political issues headlong at this moment, but we'll have to see how it plays. And obviously we're talking to the ASEANs regularly about this. Now, if the door closes, which it easily could, I would expect to see a very high level of frustration in ASEAN. But for the moment, my sense is they would rather try to use this limited opening and see if they can develop some working relationships and maybe begin to stimulate some useful discussions inside the country. There's some anecdotal, I mean, you live there, you know how the place is. There's some anecdotal evidence, otherwise known as rumor, that there are disagreements within the government, not about the fundamentals, but about how much to work with the international community and how much not to. So we have to see how that plays out, too.
Yes, the gentleman in the blue suit, right? Yep.
Colonel Datta, Foreign Policy Association. I'm curious to know where the China and India stand, which are immediate neighbor of Burma, which hasn't been cooperating at all on this important question of that you brought about human rights and the cooperation with the avians. Would you throw some light on it?
There's not a lot of light, I think, to be shed on that question. I don't want to speak for the Chinese government or the Indian government. I can tell you our perception. Our perception is that both China and India have a lot of other interests in Burma. Border issues, they have to deal with security issues, energy, commerce, perhaps a certain amount of geostrategic rivalry, and that those issues are priorities for them, and more than human rights. And so they, I would say both China and India at times have taken some helpful steps or made helpful interventions with the Burmese authorities. We would like to see a lot more, but our sense is it's because they're focused on other priorities with Burma.
Okay, this gentleman in the blue shirt.
Ambassador, good afternoon. My name is Jose Katigbak. I'm correspondent for the Manila-based Philippine Star. You spoke about China's influence in Southeast Asia, Ambassador. But could you address what might be Beijing's motives in the region and how they might clash with U.S. interests? And secondly, could you also address the question of the Spratly Islands dispute and what might be done to solve it? And would the U.S. act as a mediator?
Mm-hmm. On the first question, I'm finding myself, I should have mentioned that one of my challenges here is to try to figure out what other governments' motives are. But on China, again, I don't want to speak for the Chinese authorities. My sense is that there's a range of motives in Southeast Asia, certainly economic, commercial, security. I would assume that, like most other nations, they want to build good relations so that they have some influence. So when important foreign policy matters come up, they have some hope of winning support for those. Certainly will be times when their interests and ours don't coincide. That's sort of natural. But as I said, there's a tendency sometimes to say, wow, China's doing well. It's really gaining influence in Southeast Asia. Therefore, the U.S. must be losing. I think it's true that China is certainly much more active than it used to be, and as a result of that may have more influence. But I'm quite confident that the countries of Southeast Asia, they understand their strategic and economic interests very well. It makes perfect sense for them to have good relations with China and with us and with Japan and Australia and Korea and many others. So we don't see that creates a clash. Where there may be differences sometimes would be on trade and business practices, where we would like to encourage the Chinese to support maybe a slightly more positive agenda, or on environmental issues. So it's not a direct clash, but maybe we want to work with the Chinese more on encouraging international standards. Second question on Spratlys. We don't take a position on the various claims. We don't take a legal position on the various claims. What we've been saying for years is that we certainly do not want to see any provocative actions in the region, and that we urge the matter to be resolved by talks. And that's my very best bureaucratic answer.
Two questions on this side. First, the woman in the black shirt right back there, and then
Hi, I'm Rahila Zafar from DevX, and there are a lot of progressive Muslims in Malaysia and Indonesia and Singapore. And I was wondering if the U.S. was helping facilitate them kind of spread their message to help combat Islamic terrorism that exists in that region.
This is, as you know, a very sensitive issue. My own sense is that the countries in the region are grappling with the issues of religion and tolerance on their own. And it's generally not, I think, helpful for the U.S. to be very involved in that. Obviously, if we see examples of intolerance, we will certainly speak out. But I think these are really matters that need to be dealt with locally. What we can do and what we have been doing is promoting certainly exchanges, lots of different kinds of exchanges, not just among religious leaders, but among a wide variety of people to try to reduce misunderstandings or misperceptions and encourage dialogue among people on religious issues. And I think that's a very useful thing to do and will continue. But direct involvement, sort of supporting, quote, moderate groups against others, I think would not be productive, would not be helpful, is my view.
There was a question just a few rows up. Yes, right.
Yeah, hi, I'm Megan Mercier. I'm in the Energy Office of the State Department. And you mentioned that food and energy security are one of the emerging issues in this area. I just wondered if you could address how changes in the oil market are affecting the region. And I know that specifically Indonesia just left OPEC, so that's kind of one example. If you could start there and then maybe explain how that's affecting the rest of the region.
Sure. There is, by the way, for those of you not in the State Department, a rule that State Department colleagues have to ask easy questions, but this one's not that easy. Well, I mean, I think it obviously depends on the country. Most of the Southeast Asians are net oil importers, and so as a result have faced the same problem we and pretty much everyone else around the world has faced, was dramatically rising energy costs. For some countries like Indonesia and Malaysia, which have subsidized energy, it got to the point in Indonesia, I don't remember the exact numbers, but Indonesia energy subsidies were taking something like 25 to 30% of the entire government budget. So they were forced to reduce the subsidies, raise the price of energy, which is politically difficult in any country. So that's one aspect of it. I think it certainly is spurring the search for alternative energy, which was underway anyway. Biofuels, there's been a lot of interest in biofuels over the last few years, but with the energy problems and the food price problems coming at the same time, I think a lot of governments are taking a close look now. Is biofuels the answer, or should we be growing more food? People are looking more at nuclear energy. In a number of countries are looking at nuclear energy now and other alternative forms of energy. So I think net, it's been a very big negative because of the dramatic rise in prices. Hope that answers your question.
Well, how is your office actually kind of working on those issues as well, or working with those governments?
Well, it's been, as I think you probably know, we've been approaching the global, the energy security and food security issues more from a global perspective than by region, and within Asia, mostly in APEC. But we're just beginning to talk about amongst ourselves about how we could work with ASEAN specifically to make sure that anything that we've learned globally we can apply.
Okay, all the way in the back. Right. Yes.
My name is Daniel Lee with VOA, Vietnamese service. There is a lot of Vietnamese inside the country. They were and they are hoping that and the relationship between Vietnam and the U.S. would be more closer to the point that America will be the counterweight to China economically and militarily. Would you please explain and give us some insight about it? Thank you.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Well, the relationship with Vietnam, as you know, has improved pretty dramatically. I mentioned earlier we didn't have diplomatic relations at all in 1990. I actually went to Hanoi in 1993 and opened up the first State Department office there, and then we established diplomatic relations in 95, and it's been moving forward very rapidly. We started, many people don't realize this, we started talking with the Vietnamese or developing a relationship with the Vietnamese in the late 80s and the early 90s based really on cooperation in two areas, searching for missing Americans unaccounted for from the war and working on, through the Orderly Departure Program, to bring in Vietnamese refugees. It's now extremely broad. When Prime Minister Zoom was here a few weeks ago, he and the President talked about a whole range of issues, but climate change, the environment, health cooperation, education. He went to the Pentagon, saw Secretary Gates. I think he or maybe the Foreign Minister went to the Department of Agriculture. They met with the Interior Secretary. So it's a very broad and full agenda now. A relationship, I would say, is quite good. The one sort of thorn in the side of the relationship is Vietnam's human rights record. My own view, Vietnam, there's a lot more space in Vietnam than there was 10 or 15 years ago for people to live their lives without duress from the government, but there's still significant human rights problems, and we raise those pretty openly with the Vietnamese. They push back, but we have a pretty good discussion. So that part of the relationship is still, it's still a challenge, but overall, I think the relationship's going well, very well. It's one of the fastest growing relationships we have.
Yeah, a question just right in front, right? Yes. No, back a bit more, right where you were before, yeah.
I'm Albert Cantrell, and a quick question picking up on the gentleman's question about India and Burma. Could you expand briefly on India's interest in ASEAN and ASEAN's interests in India?
Sure. Well, I think India has, and I'm not an expert on India, so I won't try to say too much, but India is certainly trying to broaden its relationships. Sort of its Look East policy is part of that, and building certainly economic relations with Southeast Asia. ASEAN and India are working on a free trade agreement. I think they've still got a lot of work to do on it. India's been more active diplomatically in the region, and I think it's a combination of economic commercial interests and presumably geostrategic interests, maybe some energy interests that are driving it.
Yeah, let's go back to this side of the room. I thought there were some questions over here. Bob has a question.
Scott, I wonder if you wouldn't mind addressing the troubling insurgency in the south of Thailand. Successive governments in Bangkok have tried a military approach. They've tried a softer approach. Neither seems to have been notably successful, or maybe you would disagree. How serious an insurgency is this in terms of representing a fundamental threat to the integrity of Thailand? And since neither of these two approaches has worked, what might be done, and specifically what, if any, role might the United States have here?
Yeah, the insurgency in southern Thailand is very worrisome. I know it's very worrisome to the Thai authorities. I'm not an expert on southern Thailand, but what I understand from my visits there and reading and so on is, there's one of the big complaint from a lot of the ethnic Malay people in southern Thailand is that government neglect. And this is not new, over many years. and sort of discriminatory treatment. And a small percentage of them, as a result, have turned to violence. The aims of which are, and the organization is not very clear. If it's gotten better, it hasn't gotten dramatically better. So it remains, I think, a very serious problem, one I know the Thai government takes very seriously. The approach, the new government is just formulating its approach to this. The previous government did a combination of military security, law enforcement, but also what you might loosely term more hearts and minds work, trying to win support from the people. My guess is that some combination of these factors will be necessary. It's not something that I think anyone thinks can be resolved purely by military, but it'll take time. It'll be hard work. We do not anticipate a U.S. role. We don't think that would be productive. I don't think the Thai think it would be productive. If there's something useful we could do and we're asked, we would certainly consider it. But at this point, we're just watching it.
Let me ask one question. You mentioned the Malacca Strait briefly. There was a time when many spoke of terrorism as a considerable threat there. And my understanding in recent years is it seems that that's not as much the case, and that talk of that may be overblown. So I was wondering if you could comment on how safe is that strait now. Could you just comment on that briefly?
Sure. Well, I think, of course, the good news is there has not been a terrorist attack there. We all know you can never say that as a result you can predict anything about the future. There has been a reduction in piracy there, which is a good sign. The littoral countries, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore, have been working together increasingly on safety and doing some joint patrols and these sorts of things, which are helpful. So there's progress on that, and a number of so-called user nations, including the U.S., Japan, China, European nations, have all been supportive of that, although we're not directly involved. But I think you need to look at maritime security in Southeast Asia more broadly. The more immediately dangerous or problematic area is the sort of Sulawesi Sea area between eastern Malaysia, north of Sulawesi, Indonesia, and south of Mindanao, where you have had real terrorists going back and forth in the past. And so there's been a fair amount of work that we've supported, but carried out by the countries in the region to try to improve communications and work together more to reduce the risks there. So although the Malacca Straits is the huge one in terms of flow of transportation, and one we need to keep working on, there are other important straits or sea lanes that we have to also focus on.
Thanks. Were there any other questions? Yes, in the back.
My name is John Brandon. I'm with the Asia Foundation here in Washington. Scott, thank you very much for your comprehensive overview of U.S. interest in the region. I was really struck when, in the beginning of your talk, you were talking about Southeast Asia constantly needing reassurance by the United States that it cares. Yet you gave a very articulate statement on what we're doing in the region. You know, trade, $170 billion. Investment, $100 billion, but yet there seems to be a lack of understanding of what we're doing in the region, or, you know, perhaps it gets to what you said at the end, getting the word out. How do you propose we try to resolve this dilemma?
That's a good question. I think some of it is and almost inevitable. Just given the geostrategic situation there. So anything that suggests that the U.S. might move away there from there will create some concerns that we'll have to address. I think it's mostly a matter of continuing to do what we've been doing, but looking for opportunities to do more, engaging as much as we can at all levels, and getting the word out more. And so it's, this is a terrible analogy, forgive me, but it's kind of like trying to lose weight. You have to just keep going to the gym and watching what you eat every day. There's no sort of magic bullet, and I think it's mostly a matter of making sure that we're there, we're active, doing more, and that we show up and engage at all levels. If others have ideas, I'm open.
Anyone else with a question? Well, okay, yes. So we could take one or two more right here. Just wait for the microphone, please.
Hi, Prashant Paramaswaran from CSIS. I was wondering, there's been some talk about a Northeast Asia security mechanism. Not really sure what the specifics are on that. It's been very unclear. But I was wondering if there are any sort of, concrete plans or any sort of rough overview about how this might fit in with ASEAN and the ASEAN Regional Forum and all these other institutions in Southeast Asia. And I was also wondering about, speaking of showing up, how you think U.S. attendance in multilateral institutions, for example, Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice's failure to show up at a couple of meetings, might have impacted U.S. image in the region, and how you plan on addressing that as we go forward.
The Northeast Asia stuff is a little bit out of my bailiwick. There's been some talk that out of the six-party process that there could be, you've got 6 important countries in Northeast Asia talking amongst themselves, and that perhaps over time that would evolve into something more. I would really defer to my colleagues who cover Northeast Asia to say much more than that, because I'm not an expert on it. On the there's a question of Secretary Rice not going. It's one of those situations where we're very engaged in the region, and when the Secretary wasn't able to make it because of very pressing other problems in the world, I should add, people were concerned. Some people were concerned and expressed concern, is the United States not serious about Southeast Asia? I think we've shown very clearly that we're very serious about it, and it certainly is good when we have high-level visits both ways, but of course what matters is everything else that goes with that. And I think our track record on high-level visits is actually very good. I just mentioned 3 or 4 that we've either just had or will shortly have. So we're showing up at the high level. And the fact is, I think that as a country with global interests, when there are major crises or developments in the world, sometimes the Secretary of State has to divert from what she otherwise would have done to attend to those. And I think people generally understand that, but they always like to see her show up if possible. But I think fundamentally people understand that we're there in a big way.
Okay, last question is right in the back. The woman, sorry, not in the back, in the middle. Yes.
Deva Moline from DOD. Like you mentioned, ASEAN is not quite a cohesive unit, speak with one voice, but you also said that they're looking at an economic integration possibly by 2015. So I was wondering if you could comment where you see ASEAN going, if you see one country taking more of a leadership role in ASEAN, and if you see them continuing to push and pull between U.S. and China influence.
Well, ASEAN has laid out these ambitious goals, which I think is good. Economic integration being one. They're working on the blueprints for the other 2 pillars of their development, and we'll have to see what they come up with in terms of goals there. I do think there's pretty strong political will in ASEAN to move toward economic integration. Exactly what they'll achieve by 2015, we'll have to wait and see. But I do sense a pretty strong commitment to that. I do expect to see ASEAN now with a charter growing stronger. I expect, this is my one prediction, which is just me, and I may be the only one in the U.S. government who thinks this. I think human rights and democracy issues will become much more important, and I think Burma is contributing to that. You're seeing others, not just governments, but importantly parliamentarians and members of civil society in some ASEAN countries coming out and pushing hard, demonstrating about democracy or the lack thereof in other countries. So I expect to see greater pressure from the people of ASEAN for more democracy, more respect for human rights, and I think that will push ASEAN in a positive way. You know, I mean, I don't think it's too hard to say. I can't tell you what the end product is going to be. I don't think anybody can. We'll have to see how it evolves. Of the countries, I think ASEAN's pretty careful to balance things among countries and not to let one country have excessive power. Rotating the chairmanship around helps them because the chair has a significant role. Between the U.S. and ASEAN, I mean the U.S. and China, again, the ASEANs will have to decide. It strikes me as a very natural thing for ASEAN to want to have good relations with both, as well as with other important powers. It's hard for me to understand why they would want to move away from something like that and move to align clearly with one or the other. And we're not pushing them to. What we want is that the countries of ASEAN remain strong and independent.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap up now. So please join me in a round of applause for our speaker.